Good and faithful friends, Jerry Rosa here in the Rosa String Works Workshop. And yes, I know I promised to talk about intonation in the next shop talk, but then this video happened. And as I was preparing for that shop talk, I decided that I would need to put in some additional clips pre-recorded on intonation. And as I got into it, the more I got into it, this whole video took on a life of its own. So I just want you to bear with me on this. I'll be the first to admit that I get a little wordy. I use some examples as analogies, and in one case I'm using building a staircase as an analogy to building a fretboard. The reason I go into building a fretboard in intonation is because you can introduce error into your fretboard if you're not careful. And building the stairs is a very good analogy for how you can introduce error into your fretboard. So I know I get a little long-winded, just bear with me. I think it will pay off in the end. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much. Hello, my friends. Because you ask, we're going to have that discussion. You know that if this was the facts of life discussion, you know it's that discussion as a boy you have with your father, which I don't think I ever had. Or as a girl, that discussion you had with your mother, and us boys were not privy to. Or, since I'm addressing both male and female as adults, this is that other discussion that you have with your shrink. Just being silly, trying to lighten the mood. I wore the appropriate shirt for this discussion, by the way. I'm going to refer back to that. Look, I realize that intonation can be a topic of disagreement with a lot of people. There's a lot of folks that have various and different opinions than what the opinion you're going to hear here. You know, I'm telling you for black and white certainty, intonation is pretty much a black and white certainty. It is pretty much a rocket science, but it's not a complicated rocket science. It's a fairly simple science. Let me try to explain the importance of intonation first, before we get into anything else. After the instrument is built, and let's assume you've built the best instrument in the world. I mean, it's the best instrument. Nobody could build one better. Stradivari would be envious, okay? Let's just assume that. I would say your instrument isn't worth a hoot unless you can intonate it properly. Intonation is the single most important thing there is on an instrument, period. You know, all building aside, all of the other pretty things aside, you know, all that other stuff doesn't matter if the intonation is wrong. You can make the best instrument in the world and it's a pile of junk if the intonation is not correct. Okay, so how can you ensure that your intonation is correct? Well, you've seen me do it in a lot of videos. I made myself a special little rig that hooks onto the tailpiece or the tail pin of the instrument, hooks up two strings, and I can move and float the bridge until I get it exactly in the right spot. But that's kind of the end product. Let's start at the beginning and let's talk about, you know, how fretboards are made. There's an elephant in the room here that I want to get out before I get into this, because you're going to be screaming at the video the whole time. You can adjust that at the nut too. No, let's just leave that as the elephant in the room. Okay, let's not talk about adjusting the nut at this point in time. We will get to that. But just know that that's on the back shelf, or that's the elephant over there in the corner, and we're not going to talk about adjusting the nut for intonation. We're going to talk about intonation as a black and white fact of how fretboards are made and how the scale works and all that. Okay, the first thing I guess I would say about your fretboard or your fret scale, if you want to call it that, is that you can pretty much make a fret scale in just about any length you want. It's a mathematical issue. Everything is measured from a certain point to a certain point. Unlike stairs, where everything is measured like that also, from one point to another, and it's in increments. Unlike stairs, which are equal increments, fret scales slide, if you will. They obviously, we all know this already. I'm preaching to the choir, I know that. But you can see it's much wider here and it gets smaller as it goes. That has to do with the scale itself on how much smaller they get, because here on a mandolin you can see how tiny they get. On a guitar, they don't get quite so tiny. They're smaller, definitely, than where you started, but they're not tiny, tiny. And that has to do with the overall length. I'm going to use a lot of analogies in this talk, and I hope it doesn't bore you. I hope if you'll stick with me, I think you'll see the point in the analogy. Going back to the staircase issue, when you build a staircase, you have to take into account the rise that you're trying to climb. So you have to, figure that out, and you want to make it in equal increments. If you just haphazardly cut squares out, some will be one height, and the next one will be a different height, the next one will be a different height, and it's hard to walk up those kinds of stairs. So you want them all to be equal numbers, like 7 inches. It also needs to be a comfortable number for stairs. When you build stairs, and I'm sorry to digress like this, but I think you'll see my point here if you'll pay attention. When you build stairs, you use a square like this, and most guys that build squares have these deals that lock onto their square, or they have some other kind of pattern, but they often have a deal like this that will lock onto their square, and say at the 7 inches, which is a comfortable stepping height, they'll lock this little deal on there, and they'll perhaps on the depth going the other way, they'll lock it at a different point, maybe at 10 inches, something like that. But the rise is, the 10 inches is the length of the stair, and the rise is 7 inches there. So you've got 2 locks at those 2 points. Let's say you have 16 steps going up to get to your height. You didn't wear your glasses that day. Let's say you marked it at 7 1/16 of an inch, and you have 16 stairs up. And so you mark this, and you mark your board, and this is a cumulative marking. So you mark this one, then you move it up to that mark, and then you move it up to that mark, and you move it up to that mark, and you mark it, and you mark it, and you mark it. But you're off by 1/16 of an inch. Since you have 16 steps, when you get to the top, you're 1 full inch off. Some people say, that's not that big a deal, no big deal, but it's what they call a trip hazard, because you're used to stepping at a certain place, and you're going to trip when you get to the top, or stub your toe or something. There's going to be a problem. It's a cumulative error, because you measured from one stair to the next stair to the next stair to the next stair, and each one of those was off by a 16th. The next one's off by 2/16, the next one's off by 3/16, 4/16, etc. This is an important concept to understand, especially if you want to make your own fingerboard down the road. That's the reason you don't use that method to make fingerboards. Every single thing on a fingerboard is measured from right here. That fret right there is measured from right here. This fret is not measured from this fret, it's measured from here. This fret is measured from here. That fret is measured from here. The reason being, some people don't do it that way. Let me explain to you that some people don't do it this hard way of measuring from the same and making a new measurement each time, okay? Some folks don't do that. They know what the measurements are, and they just add the difference on, and they'll say, okay, well, this one was 1.5. Well, this one's supposed to only be 1 and something, so they'll just kind of measure from here over that far. But if you got this one slightly off, just slightly off, now this one's already got that slight amount error, plus whatever error you make on this one, see? And it gets cumulative, and you're way off by the time you get up here. Where if you always measure from here to the fret, 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 etc., etc., etc. Then the most you can be off is whatever little minor tiny error you made on that specific fret. I hope that makes sense to you, because that's a very important concept. Instead of having a cumulative error, you just have a single error right there. And if you're, even if you're bad, hopefully you're off only by 1,000th or two, just a few thousandths, because you can be very precise. On my first half dozen instruments I built, I made my own fingerboards. And the joke on this one is, I told my wife, I said, go to the store and find me a ruler that measures in hundredths of inches. And I told her, I said, and don't come back till you find one. Because I thought, boy, this will really be a hard task to find. I didn't even know if they made a ruler that measures in hundredths of inches. Well, dang if she didn't come back. And she had a ruler. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see her again. Anyway, she came back and she had a ruler that measures in hundredths of inches. Now, if in hindsight, I would have told her to find one that measured in thousands. I'm pretty sure they don't make those. So what I did was I taped the ruler I physically taped it down like this. And I took an X-Acto knife with that super, super sharp point and a large magnifier over the top of it. And I knew what the measurements were for each fret, because I had either calculated it or found it on the computer or something. I don't even remember how I found that now. May have been in the book, I don't remember. But I had those measurements from the end on every fret. And what I did was, I would get down under that magnifier and with that sharp X-Acto, and I would guess the thousandths. So there's 10 thousandths in between each of those hundredths. So, a hundredth of an inch is pretty dang tiny. Okay, I wasn't perfect. But because I measured from on each fret, I couldn't be off by very much, okay? And, I guessed where the thousandths were, and I marked it the best I could. And it worked. All of those fretboards, I would put up against just about any fretboard. They all work really well. You can't tell a bit of difference between one of those and a store-bought, fingerboard. However, if I had used the other method, and moved the ruler on each fret and tried to, just add on, there's no chance that it would have been right. It wouldn't even have been close. So I hope I've made my point about that, because it's an important point. Why is it important? Well, because if you go monkeying with this up here, which is where your nut is, if you change this, in other words, you shorten this, because let's just give you a good example, as in the recent video on the Sam Bush mandolin. The binding didn't come all the way up. It was short by like 1/10 of an inch or less. It just didn't go to the end. Let's say you shorten this so that it matches the binding. You've just changed every single fret on this thing. Every single fret just got messed up. By whatever amount you shorten that. Now your scale doesn't work anymore, because your scale back to your bridge saddle back here is a set distance from here to here, okay? I am not smart enough to know how to figure all those scales out. You can do it on the computer these days, very simple. You can just say, I'm making a 25 1/4 inch scale, where do my frets go? And it'll calculate it and tell you where they go. It's just that simple. You don't have to know that math. Therefore, I don't know the math. I'm not even going to pretend like I do, because there's no point in having to know that. But the point is, you want to do it in measuring everything from here. And like I said, this is a sacred place. You don't mess with this. Don't change the length of this right here at all. Because if you do, you've just messed up every single thing on here and your total fret scale and everything. I hope that's perfectly clear. If you disagree with that, read the shirt. Okay? All right, so that's point number one. So stair treads and fretboards need to be precise. Okay? So now that you've got that, now that you've got a perfect fingerboard, and you might say, well, why don't you make your fingerboards now still? Well, the point is, that's a lot of work. and you can buy them just as good. So what's the point? I can't improve on this. I can't make it any better than the scales I can buy. So why not just buy them? You know, I mean, and so that's the one wooden part on an instrument that I don't make anymore, because it just takes so much time and you really can't make it any better than you can buy anyway. Let's get into the actual setup of your intonation and we'll talk about that. Okay, we just happen to have a German Hofner guitar here that has the fretboard off of it. Often in my videos, people comment, just take the fretboard off, or just take the bridge off, or just take the back off, or just take something off, just take it off. Every time you do that, you're messing with your intonation. And you think, how could you be messing with your intonation if you take the back off? Well, that makes this side flexible and the neck goes up and down like this now, and you're moving your fret scale slightly when you do that. Everything affects the fret scale, everything affects your intonation. Be really careful about taking anything apart on a guitar if you don't know how it affects your intonation, because you will not be happy with the results. It can also affect your action on how high your strings are on your guitar, everything. So everything matters. That's the first thing you should know. Now that this is taken off of here, how do I know where to put it? Should I put it there? Should I put it here? You know, sure, I can kind of line it up where it used to be, but you already heard me say we measure these in thousandths of an inches from up here. Okay, now this one has what they call a 0 fret. So everything in this case is measured in thousandths of inches from that fret. So you could theoretically cut the end of this off a little bit. It wouldn't hurt anything because you still have a 0 fret. We could talk about 0 frets, but that's really a totally different discussion, and it really doesn't have much to do with intonation. Everything I tell you about intonation is true for a 0 fret also. It's just that that 0 fret becomes the end of the fingerboard. That, you know, that sacred place. So you don't mess with your 0 fret. You leave it where it is, but you can, you know, you could mess with the end of that fingerboard there, since it does have a 0 fret. Okay, but my point is, how do you know where to put this back? Well, it has to be exactly where it's supposed to be, otherwise you got a problem. Now, you could simply measure from here to here and call it good enough, but if you're off by, say, 5/1000ths of an inch, which doesn't sound like much, and it isn't much, it's tiny. It's less than the thickness of a piece of notebook paper. I mean, that's not much. But now, if you're off by that much when you glue this back, now every one of those frets is off by that much. Does that make sense to you? Because that's the way it works. It's black and white science. In this case, for the most part, I can feel this lock into its original spot. I'd probably be pretty close, but I still could be off. So how do I actually get this right? The best way I have found to do that is to put the 2 strings over the, you know, lock them onto here, take 2 strings, go right over your bridge, and, you know, in this case, we'd have to put a temporary nut here or something, and, you know, we'd slide the fingerboard back and forth and check the intonation until we got the intonation perfect. We'd have to glue it in place right there and clamp it in place right there. I've shown how to check that, set that intonation in the past, and I will show you that again here in just a moment, but that's, you know, that's a separate discussion all by itself. My point about this is that every single thing you do on an instrument matters on your intonation. You can't hardly do anything, at least in a big way. In other words, taking the neck off, taking the back off, taking the bridge off, taking the fretboard off, every single thing you do like that is going to affect your intonation. And you need to be aware of that and make sure you get things back where they're supposed to be. Otherwise, you will not be happy. Okay, for actually setting the intonation, I'm going to use a mandolin as an example because it's easier than setting up that rig on the guitar. It works exactly the same. There's no difference at all between putting the little temporary rig on here with the 2 strings and putting it up here, and floating your bridge on a guitar is the same as floating the bridge on this mandolin. It doesn't matter the scale, it doesn't matter what kind of instrument. Intonation is intonation, and it works the same on every single instrument. Even banjos can be intonated, believe it or not. That's another banjo joke. So, how do you really set your intonation properly? Okay, so the best way to intonate an instrument is you bring it up to pitch. Well, first of all, you have to just approximate where the bridge goes when you're first doing this. You get it as close as you can, and you can do that with a measurement or by eye. On most F-hole instruments, for the most part, the bridge goes across these two inner points, roughly. So that gives you a rough idea already. But it is only a rough idea. You note the note until you get your tuner noting dead center. Okay, so that's close enough for my dead center for the moment, for the illustration anyway. And now you note it at the 12th fret. And it should hit the exact same point on your tuner. You can even do this at a lower pitch. In other words, I have this at a G right now, but if I only had it at a E, for instance, it would still do basically the same thing. Now, you're better off bringing it up to pitch to do it, but you can kind of get close even at a lower pitch on your string. It doesn't really matter too terribly much because it should work the same at whatever note you're using. So anyway, so open, this is a G when I note it at the 12th fret, and the 12th fret is the key point because on all instruments at the 12th fret, it should be the same exact note. And let's just, for sake of example, just to kind of dive in deeper than we need to go, let's say that when you note it open, you're just about let's just say one human hair short of being top dead center. In other words, you're just slightly to this side by just a hair. Well, then when you note it here at the 12th fret, you should still be just slightly one hair to the left. That means you've got perfect intonation. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but some people are, obsessed about getting the needle perfectly top dead center. Well, that's okay. It doesn't really matter, though, as long as the needle goes to the exact same place when you note it at the 12th fret. It really won't make any difference. It's all relative in that case. But the point is you want to get the exact same note open as you do when you note it at the 12th fret. Now, you need to do it a bunch of times because these tuners can lie a little bit. And when I say lie, they're really accurate, so I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying those kinds of sympathetic notes and different kinds of vibrations and noises can get in here and throw a slight false reading on your tuner temporarily. So you want to check it a lot of times. Don't just do it once and go, okay, I'm right. Open and check it open, and then check it closed. And it should be in the same exact place. And then you move this floating bridge accordingly till you get it right. And here's the way I remember it. When you note it at the 12th fret, if it is sharp on your tuner, then that means the string is too short. Sharp is short. Sharp means the string is short. So, in other words, that means you need to lengthen your bridge. So you would pull your bridge back just a tiny bit. If, when you note it, the note is flat at the 12th fret, in other words, it's correct, but when you note it, it's flat, that means your bridge is too far back. Flat is far back. That's how I remember it. F and F, S and S, Sharp is short, flat is too far back. Then you would, of course, move your bridge slightly forward. Often, you have to do this. You have to adjust your bridge one way or the other to get it to intonate correctly. Then you say, well, what about the middle strings? Well, that's why these mandolin saddles are compensated. And to be perfectly honest with you, this is where we start talking about compromise. There is compromise in intonation, and we are going to go into that discussion right now. Okay, do you remember the elephant that's sitting over there in the corner? I told you that we were going to talk about this eventually. This is the discussion I don't want to have because this is the discussion where you really need to read this shirt. Because so many people, and I'm not going to name any names, But so many people believe you can intonate at the nut and do just fine. Let's talk about compromise. The problem with compromise is neither one of you got what you really, truly wanted. The same thing happens on a fingerboard. When you start messing with the nut, you are not fixing a problem. I know some of you believe you are. You are just simply compromising. I am not saying it's 100% wrong to compromise in a situation like that. What I'm saying is you are compromising, and you should know you are compromising, and you should know the effects of it. That's why I don't do it. I do not ever screw with the nut in terms of intonation. As we go back to the original discussion, every single one of these frets is measured from that point. When you start messing with that point, you just mess with every fret here. Whether you believe you have or not, you have messed with every fret on this fretboard. Okay, so once again, this sacred location, if you will, and back here somewhere you have your saddle. When you note it at the 12th fret, you see that you are sharp. So you need to slide your saddle further back to lengthen the scale, because when you're sharp, you're short. So you got to go further. Okay, and let's just keep it in even numbers. 100 thousandths of an inch, which would be 2.5 millimeters. Okay, so you need to move it back 100 thousandths of an inch to make it right. Let's just say that. Okay. Some folks would have you believe that you could move your nut forward approximately the same amount or somewhere in there. The reason that that doesn't work, you can move this back no problem, because as a percentage of the scale, that 100 thousandths is very minimal. When you consider the length from here all the way to here, the percentage you moved this little bit right here is so minimal, it doesn't even hardly matter. But if you moved forward with the saddle 100 thousandths of an inch, and I realize this isn't a practical example most of the time, okay? I understand that, but it makes the point. If you move forward with your string, in your nut to do that same lengthen, then you've just added 100 thousandths of an inch to this first fret. Now, you didn't do that when you moved it back here. You didn't change that first fret by no 100 thousandths of an inch. You changed it only by a tiny percentage stretched over that full length. That's what I think I needed to explain here and make that point. Any amount you change it up here is a huge percentage based on the short distance right here. But when you move it that same amount over this long distance, it's a tiny percentage. And your frets are not nearly as affected. I hope that makes sense to you. It sure makes sense to me. Now back to the rest of the video. Okay, so let me just add one more thing. Even having said what I just said about, when you move the same amount up here, you're compromising this first fret by a much bigger percentage. Sometimes, on some unique situation, it might still be necessary to compensate the nut. I could understand that. Me personally, I haven't run into that situation where I felt like I had to do that. But it might make sense rather than having to maybe physically move your whole bridge or something like that. But you should realize that you really are compromising much more on a percentage basis, especially to your first fret, second fret, that kind of thing, because you're talking about that much of a movement over a very tiny distance, where over here, that much movement is spread across this whole distance. It's a huge difference. And I just think you need to understand that. I hope it makes sense. I am able to get almost all instruments to intonate nearly perfectly by messing with the bridge down here. Now, you can definitely compensate one string here and do pretty dang well. It's just not right to do it up here. I'm sorry, it's just not right. I know that a whole bunch of people are going to disagree with me on that. Sorry, just read the shirt. It's math. Math doesn't really lie. It's measured from this point, and you should leave this point as sacred, in my opinion. That part's opinion, I agree. I think I've just said everything I know about intonation and then some. Maybe I've even said stuff I don't know. I hope I've explained it in a way that makes sense, and I hope that that will help you and to understand how important intonation is. There is nothing more important than intonation on your instrument. You can make it out of the finest wood in the world, and it's still crap if it doesn't intonate properly. I'm done. What are we going to do now? Thanks. Hope you got something out of it.